Let's talk about this chapter. Leviticus 26, when did these events happen? We are in approximately 1490 BC, about 1 year after the Israelites got out of slavery in Egypt. They are at Mount Sinai getting instructions from God. They're on their way to the Canaan land. I've just got one term to define in our definitions section, and that is the term covenant. I think we've touched on this one before. A covenant is an agreement between two people, or two groups of people. In this case, it's an agreement between God and his people. God will bless his people if they obey him and keep his instructions. Let's talk about that covenant as we move on into our outline. Verses 1 through 13, God promises to bless the Israelites if they are obedient. So if the Hebrews would refrain from worshiping idols, if they would keep God's Sabbath days, if they would reverence the holy things and the tabernacle and obey the Lord's commands, then God promised to bless them and to make them prosper in Canaan, this land that he was going to give them. He promised that he would send rain for their crops and cause their fields to produce in abundance. He promised to remove, quote, harmful beasts from the land and to give them victory over their enemies. God told them that he would multiply their children and that he would walk amongst them as their God as long as they did as he requested and followed his instructions and kept the laws that he was sharing with Moses on Mount Sinai. Our second and our biggest section, verses 14 through 39, God promises punishment for disobedience. If the Israelites didn't listen to God and they ignored his commands instead and they broke covenant with him, then he assured them that they would be punished. Instead of giving them peace, God would give them constant anxiety from their enemies, anxiety of disease coming into their camp, and famine plaguing their land. If they continued and persisted in disobedience, then God told them that he would increase their punishments and he would break their pride. He would take away their food and he would give their enemies power over them. And then finally he says, if things get worse, I will destroy your cities and I will scatter you among the nations. But the chapter does end with some good news in verses 40 through 46. There's an opportunity for forgiveness discussed. If the Israelites were in fact disobedient and were punished by God, but later had a change of heart, then God promised not to forget the covenant that he had made with their forefathers being, in this case, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. If they would repent of their wickedness and confess their evil deeds and humble themselves, then God would not destroy them entirely, and he would once again be their God and be their protector. And now for our application. This chapter gives us some insights into the rest of the Old Testament story and into the reliability of God's promises. So we have here some promises, and we ask as we go through the rest of the Old Testament, does God keep these? You'll notice that the larger part of this chapter discusses the punishments that would be received for disobedience, and the smaller section talks about the blessings that would be received for obedience. Well, this imbalance is reflected in the story of the Israelite nation. The Israelites spent more time disobeying God, so it's probably more relevant to discuss the punishments here in more detail. They spent more time disobeying God than they did obeying him. And as we read the upcoming books in the Old Testament, we'll see that God's promises, both of blessing and of punishment, were kept and they played out in the lives of his people. Israel enjoyed blessings when they were obedient, and they were also inflicted with every single punishment that is mentioned in this chapter due to persistence and disobedience. So one application for us is that God keeps his promises. And that sounds really simple, but that also seems like a topic of a lot of debate today. God keeps his promises both of blessing and of punishment. If God promises heaven to the faithful, and he promises hell to the unfaithful and the disobedient, then we have every reason to believe that both promises will be kept. A lot of people want to have God keeping all of his promises of blessing while forgetting about all of his promises of punishment. But that's not the God who we see, and there's ample opportunity through the grace that's offered in Jesus to receive all the blessings. But if we spurn that opportunity, the promises of punishment are just as faithful as the promises of grace and blessing.